This episode is one of a new series we are calling the SF Cultural. In this new series, I'm hoping to interview storytellers, writers, poets, musicians, anyone who's demonstrating the truth of Christianity by appealing to the imagination. So Plato once wrote, "Those who tell stories rule society," and I tend to agree with him on that. My guest today is a friend of mine, Donald Catchings, and Donald and I met at the apologetics program at Houston Baptist University. Donald has recently written a companion to the Chronicles of Narnia. It's called Joy Through a Wardrobe, and we're going to talk about his book today, introduce you to his book. So it is a companion to C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia. If you grew up on the Narnia stories, or even if you found them later in life, they likely impacted you, especially if you're a Christian. They impacted you in a significant way. And so at HBU, Donald studied under a lot of the excellent cultural apologists out there, um, including the C.S. Lewis scholar Michael Ward, and under the guidance of those such as Dr. Ward, Dr. Holly Ordway. Uh, Donald has been working hard to put together this companion, and I think any Narnia fan would definitely enjoy this companion to the Chronicles of Narnia. So I hope you enjoy this episode of the SF Cultural. And Donald, it's great to have you on. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing good, Clark. Doing good, man.
Good. All right, man. Well, let's jump into it. You and I, we study cultural apologetics at Houston Baptist University, and it's a little bit different. We were talking before the podcast. It's a little bit different than just the typical philosophical approach to apologetics, where we're giving these arguments for God's existence. Um, Cultural apologetics is a lot of times maybe appealing to those arguments, but more so through imaginative mediums. So storytelling. When you read the Chronicles of Narnia, there's a story there, and it also is teaching you as you're reading it something about God, something about Christianity, and people may even read those stories and if they aren't aware of that or miss that, they may even miss it because Lewis is so subtle and so just brilliant about you know giving off that message, but through a imaginative medium. So that's what cultural apologetics is. It's storytelling, it's music, it's poetry, but it's these arts defending the faith in a way, by appealing to the imagination. So for those who are new to apologetics, maybe you could expound on how there's a need for cultural apologetics today, and how your book is a work of cultural apologetics.
Sure. Actually, yeah, I think when people run into the arguments for Christianity in our modern culture, if they run into them at all, they'll see the strictly philosophical side. They'll see all of the arguments for whether it be moral apologetics or whether it be some kind of apologetics that bases off of biology or physics or straight philosophical without any science, just the philosophical arguments of logic. And it's all about information, fact, fact, fact. And it doesn't feel like it plays on imagination whatsoever. It's just about this is a factual statement, take it or leave it. And it becomes an argument. And this isn't a negative thing. It's a good thing that we have good sound arguments, but I think the problem is that these arguments tend to push people away, put people on the defensive. Whenever you tell someone, no, that's not true, this is true, rather than listening to what may in fact be the truth, they usually will shut themselves down and push it away and try to prove themselves right. Now, this is not just people who are not Christians who do this. Christians do this as well. Sometimes we are given completely valid questions, completely valid arguments, even against maybe something that we truly hold to be dear to us. And rather than considering it, we push back. Now, cultural apologetics does something different. It doesn't push a fact into your face. What it does is it gives you a story, and it compels you via that story to listen and to read or whatever it may be, or to watch if it's a film. And as you watch or listen or read this story, your imagination works. And as your imagination works, you start to reason on things without even recognizing you're doing it. And eventually, by the end, you come to a truth that could have been blasted at your face from the beginning through one simple statement that was a fact. But rather than doing that, cultural apologetics gives you a story that gives you a truth that you work out in your own mind through your own imagination that allows you to take it in. And sometimes you come to that point without even realizing it. And I think our world needs that kind of apologetic today, needs that kind of reasoned argument. Actually, funny enough, it is a reasoned argument, but through imagination. We need that today because people are not wanting to be shouted at. They're not wanting to be argued with. People are, and maybe this is natural to humankind throughout history, people are wanting to hear a story. They're wanting to, if anything, be reasoned with softly. And imaginative apologetics does that. And to be honest, I think foundations for imaginative apologetics really even go into the great philosophers of Western culture. When we go to people like Plato, one of his or some of his better and more convincing arguments don't come from straight facts that are thrown in your face. They come from examples like the allegory of the cave. Because they're a story, we allow it to take hold and we listen and we listen and we go with it until in the end we've already come to probably even agreeing with him without even realizing it because he gives us a story. And I think that's what cultural apologetics really is. It gives you that story and allows you to make up your mind through your imagination without pushing a fact into your face and making you defensive automatically. It allows you to just easily reason about that, uh, whatever the argument may be, because that's really what it is in the background. It allows you to reason with it slowly and progressively with the story until at the end you've actually made up your own mind about it and you didn't have to be argued with. You just came to the conclusion if the author's done their apologetics correctly, you've come to the conclusion that they wanted you to have in the beginning, but you've done it on your own by reading. And so I think we really need that in our culture. There's enough people pushing things in your face. We don't need to be pushed in the face anymore. What we need is someone to tell us a story and softly lead us into that truth that we so desperately need in our culture, in our world.
Right. Yeah. There's so many times where conversations can just lose their way. And with family members or with people that you love or that you care about or friends, when you disagree about whether it be politics or religion, which seems to be the two most hostile subjects out there, but, whether
Right.
you disagree on something, sometimes, these stories can bring people together in a way that we do find what we do agree with. I think if we don't have the same starting point, when we argue or we try to do apologetics in an argumentative way, um, it sometimes feels like we're going nowhere. I mean, I've made progress in those conversations, but it's very rare. But a film or a story or a book, the Chronicles of Narnia, there are people who love the Chronicles who don't believe in God at all, but they've enjoyed the stories, and whether they realize it or not, there is so much Christianity involved in the story, and there's so much of a Christian. Well, it's all Christian. It's explicitly Christian, but it's told in such a way that it appeals to anyone. And I think when Jesus, walked the earth, instead of giving these great arguments for why he was the savior, he told stories and told parables and taught in parables. And I just hope that we haven't lost that art as Christians of teaching in that way. So your book, let's talk about your book because that's what I brought you here for today. But Joy Through a Wardrobe. Uh, just give us a rundown of what your book is, what it's about, what's Joy Through a Wardrobe.
Okay. Well, Joy Through a Wardrobe is really it's poetry and reflections on C.S. Lewis's first published chronicle, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And what I've done with this work is I've uh, taken each chapter and Joy Through each chapter in the chronicle, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I've taken each chapter and I've written three poems and written a single reflection to highlight the spiritual nature or the spirit that is within that chapter that helps to develop the spirit that encompasses or governs, influences the whole book. If you were to read Dr. Michael Ward's Planet Narnia or the Narnia Code, both are making the same argument that each one of the Chronicles of Narnia, the imagery, the motifs, and the things that we find in each chronicle are governed by one of the planets within the pre-Copernican cosmos. Not to make that very difficult, there simply were 7 planets in the medieval mind, and each one of the planets C.S. Lewis used to govern how he wrote the book, to bring out the spiritual influence or characteristics of those planets. And like I said, I'm not going to make it complicated, and just to say that Jupiter is the planet that he used for The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And Jupiter is the kingly planet. It's Fortuna Major. It's the good fortune, kingly planet. It's where we get the idea of jovial from, because Jupiter is Jove in the medieval mindset. So what I have done is written Joy Through a Wardrobe to try to bring that out, to allow the readers of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe to, when they read that chronicle, that they can read my book along with it, and it bring out that joviality. It bring out that, maybe in a kind of limited sense in our own minds today, what truly is joy is what we're meant to find in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And my book helps the reader find joy. When you read it, you see Jove moving, you see Jupiter moving, you see the joviality, you see it come out, or you see even sometimes the conflict between what would be Jupiter and Saturn. You see that conflict between what would be joy and what I think maybe some would consider being uh, the very opposite of joy, envy and strife and those types of things. You see those fighting against each other. And what ends up overcoming in the end is joy. The reader is meant to do as the Pevensies have done, find joy through the wardrobe. They go through the wardrobe to find joy, joviality, Jupiter. They find him. And that's what this poetry and the reflections within my work are meant to do, to help the reader better contemplate and then hopefully enjoy joy.
Yeah. Yeah. So for those listeners that are maybe they've read the Chronicles, but maybe they haven't gone in depth studying all the C.S. Lewis scholars that are out there and what they have to say, because there's so many great books. Michael Ward, Rowan Williams, there's so many great books out there that discuss the Chronicles. But if they haven't read Planet Narnia, it can be a lot to wrap your mind around. So,
Yes.
um, you know, you mentioned the pre-Copernican model of the universe and planetary influences, and these are things that Dr. Ward has written an incredible book that's just rich with information that goes through all of Lewis's work. Uh, so maybe you could expound on that a bit more too, for just a layperson out there. Why joy? Is there, maybe just you mentioned joy's connection to Jupiter, but maybe expound on that a little bit and break it down. I know for sure that when you read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Dr. Ward argues that there is such a jovial, you mentioned jovial, or the theme of joy in this sense. It's not joy in the sense that we typically define the word either. So maybe you could explain the difference between how we typically see joy versus what you're getting at here.
Okay. Yeah, it's very difficult, funny enough, to try to explain these things because they're so high-minded, they're so big, and I'm trying to even take this big idea from Planet Narnia, and I'm trying to make it smaller, make it easier to understand, where even a young person can understand it. Someone who's never read Planet Narnia, that has no clue about that medieval mindset of planetary influence. So I'll try to do my best to break that down. When it comes to joy, we today often look at joy and we think of somebody just being happy. That we just leave it simple as that. It's just another synonym for being happy. And that misses out on so much of the depth that's within the word joy, and so much of the root of the word, where it comes from, joy. So what we find, and what I've written this book for, is that people will be able to experience the fullness of the word joy. And I'm afraid that we in our world today we seek to be happy, we seek to have joy, and what we find in the end is we miss out on the fullness of it because we don't see who's behind it and who is really truly behind the fullness of joy. So, what joy really is, what joviality really is something that's a fullness of character. It's about not just being happy and not just finding happiness within our own lives and making us smile. Joy is about being able to smile and be happy even when things aren't good. It's being able to stand up, look forward at the battle that's coming at us, and know that we have something beyond that battle, whether we win or whether we lose, that we can have contentment in. Something that tells us no matter what happens in this world, no matter what happens in this life, everything will be okay. Because truly, in the end, Aslan will win. In the end, Aslan will still be king of Narnia. In the end, we will find that evil will lose no matter what happens. And with that kind of a knowledge, we can have joy in any situation. We can have that true joviality. I think one of the characters that best explains joy, uh, and I'm so glad that I've read Dr. Ward's work to help me understand this, is Father Christmas. Father Christmas, or Santa Claus, as we think of him, is that one character that shows us what joviality and what joy truly is, especially as Lewis represents him within The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. We think of Father Christmas, we think of Santa Claus sometimes as just some jolly old fat man that laughs all the times and laughs all the time and gives away gifts. But there's more to him, especially in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. We find that he's not just some jolly old fat guy that laughs too much. We find that he is actually a character who has a type of seriousness about him. He's not just happy in a sense that makes us be like, all right, man, that's enough laughing, that's enough happiness. Let's get serious. He's the kind of character that laughs when it is most necessary. He laughs, even can laugh in the most serious moment because he knows truly what joy is. He's that kind of character that looks at and balances the world and sees that there's a child here who's in grave danger and I'm going to give them what they need while at the same time bringing them happiness and joy through uh, like crumpets and tea. He gives them tea and cake. He makes sure that they have provisions that will make them feel good on the inside, but he also gives them the provisions of a cordial that has a magic potion in it that'll heal any wound, and he gives a sword to one, he gives a bow and arrow to another. So he's that perfect balance between what I could say is kind of the chivalry of joviality between that lionheartedness and laughter.
Mm.
Lionheartedness and laughter is that regalness that is truly joy, that we can look in the face of danger and we can know that we can challenge that danger with the fullness of courage because in the end we have that one who will give us victory whether we lose this battle or not. And that is what joy truly is, knowing that whether we win or whether we lose the battle, the war is won in Aslan, in Christ.
Yeah.
That's what joy is. That's what joy truly is.
Yeah, you mentioned this. I was you read Planet Narnia, and uh, Dr. Ward talks about the critics of Lewis that were just surprised at the stories. They were surprised that he would even include Father Christmas in this world that he created, and here here's Santa Claus in this world. But if you look at it through the lens that Dr. Ward has kind of seemed to figure out from the Lewis Chronicles of if there's a jovial influence, then this character actually represents this jovial influence so well. And so I think if you're a listener here, and this is a little bit much to wrap your mind around, um, Dr. Ward's book is an extensive book that goes through. I mean, we're here today to talk about the companion, but the planetary influences and Jupiter and Mars and how the medievals saw those planets and how they impacted the world. And so he does a connection to that. The discarded image that Lewis wrote so much about. It's one of Lewis's greatest works. Um, So there's a lot here. There's a lot more depth to the Chronicles than I think people realize at first glance. Yes, you can read them and enjoy them as a child growing up, but now as an adult, as I'm seeing the connections to the medieval thoughts and the medieval worldview, it even becomes more enriched and more. There's more to it. So it must be difficult for anyone, Donald, to write a companion to such a just it's a deeper book than people realize. Even Tolkien was critical of the book, but when you look at it through this lens, uh, or he was critical of the stories, but when you look at it through this lens, it's there's a lot to it. If especially if Dr. Ward's thesis is right, which I believe it is. So when you say you're writing a companion to the Chronicles of Narnia, what does that mean, and what does that look like? Another companion to the Chronicles, what's that look like, and how is yours different from other works on the Chronicles of Narnia?
Okay, and I'm very happy you phrased the question in that manner. As a companion, it's simple as it's meant to be read alongside The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Joy Through a Wardrobe is the companion for The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and it's meant to be read alongside it. Though I think it can be read on its own, especially if you've already are already familiar with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. You can read Joy Through a Wardrobe on its own, uh, but it's meant to be read alongside it. And I think what is different between my work and and others who have written on Lewis, there are plenty of other books out there about C.S. Lewis, about the Chronicles of Narnia, about The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. There's plenty of great works out there, great books out there. But what I've done is something a little different. What I've seen other people do is take on more of that philosophical side of things, try to show and highlight the theology underneath it all, try to highlight the philosophy underneath it all, and they try to bring all that out. But what they miss when they're doing that, when they're making their philosophical arguments, is they miss the very thing that the Chronicles are themselves, which is imaginative. So, what I have done, though I do have reflections, primarily this book is about the poetry that I've written that is meant to highlight those spiritual influences of the book, the theological intentions of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I've written, like I said, 3 poems per chapter. So each poem is kind of a beginning, middle, and end of the chapter. So the first poem is meant to be for the beginning of the chapter, the second poem for the middle, the third poem for the end. It's kind of meant to encompass the chapter. What I've done is I've taken the imagination, what's highlighted within our own imaginations when we're reading each chapter of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, something sticks out. Specifically, some kind of characteristic within the book, some kind of characteristic of Jupiter, of Jove, of joy, some kind of characteristic sticks out. In and what you do, and what I did, is I took that characteristic that stuck out, or that event that stuck out, and I wrote a poem about it. And I tried to highlight that imagination. And I actually started with the third poem of my book. I actually is where I started. And I think it's actually how Lewis, as far as I know from the history of it all, Lewis started The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe with an image in his mind of a fawn holding an umbrella and carrying parcels. That's actually how I started and I didn't do it on purpose. That's how I started my book, The Joy Through a Wardrobe. I sat down and I thought, what would I do if I were going to write poetry on this book? I mean, I felt like I wanted to write some poetry on The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. What would I do? Sat down, I read the first chapter, and it was A Meeting of Friends is the first poem that came to my head, and it almost came out automatically. Crunch, crunch, under my feet. Crunch, crunch, a mystery. The cold, the light, the lamp, or the cold, the night, the lamppost light. A strange new wood, winter delight. Crunch, crunch, over the snow. And that's how the image came out in my mind, was the meeting between Lucy and Mr. Tumnus, and I made it a poem that is about what you imagine in your head. It's meant to bring it to a different light and highlight that meeting of friends, to bring out that character of a little girl who has joy in her heart and is seeking adventure. Ends up in this strange world, and she's looking around with this joy, with this hope, with this adventure mindset of a child. And there's the strangest thing in the world. And not only is she obviously inside a wood within a wardrobe that has snow, and then there's a lamppost from that doesn't fit. Now there's a fawn carrying what looks to be Christmas parcels, holding an umbrella, wearing a muffler, and it's the strangest sight in all the world. But that's really where the beginning of all the joy and wonder comes from. And so what makes my work different is I try to take that joy and that wonder that Lewis meant for us to look along whenever we're reading his work, that stuff that draws us really into the story, that imagination that begins to go in our heads, tick in our heads, that draws us into the story, that makes us love it. I try to take those elements and write a poem about it to draw us further into it. And that's what makes my work different from the other works that are out there for anything that C.S. Lewis has done or any work on The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Joy Through a Wardrobe highlights the imagination by using imagination. And then I reflect on what we have imagined later, but I primarily focus on the imagination via my poetry.
Yeah, you sent me the book, a little advanced reading copy. So I was able to look through the PDF of the book and before you had published it and read through a lot of the poems myself. And I will say, um, at reading through it, they're so rich with imagery, with powerful language. It's very hard to write poetry, and we learned this in our creative writing class that you and I took together at Houston Baptist. Dr. Ordway is a well accomplished poet, and of course, many of her colleagues are really well accomplished poets. And so, when I was having to write poetry in a grad school and have someone like that look at the poetry, it was so intimidating because it really is one of the most difficult disciplines in the world to write poetry effectively and powerfully because it really makes you just have to zoom in on the words or just hone in on the words. Every little word matters in such a short, writing. And for people listening, Dr. Ordway said this in our class that poetry is the most popular literary form in the world. And the reason is because we listen to songs daily, and those songs are organized to have a meter, a lot of times a rhyme. So those songs are poems, and so I like to think of your companion as something very different than a lot of those that I've read because it has so much poetry, and
Mhm.
it's a unique way to read the Chronicles and then reflect on the Chronicles. So I like to think of it as songs that accompany the story, and that makes it unique. And so when I'm reading, these poems, maybe, and I like the way that you have your book set up because it's sort of a chronological order. I can be reading a story and then find something that matches this scene in the story or, this portion of the Chronicles. And so it's really neat just to be able to reflect on them, to read through them again, but also hear the music that accompanies these stories. I think now, you may talk about this in the book, I don't know, but for me, there's a connection between poetry and the story where Aslan sings the Chronicles into existence, or the world of Narnia into existence. There's so much power in that idea of his voice and singing the world into existence. And poetry is it's a song. It's there's a meter, there's a beat to it. So anyway, I think it's really unique in that sense that your poetry is something that's a staple of this book. And yeah, just kudos on that. I think you should be proud of that. The poetry
Thank
is great, and it's difficult to be a poet. It's it's difficult to write powerful poetry. I've tried my hand at it, and it's tough. Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
I definitely tried to format my poetry to where, and I'm glad you mentioned the idea of music. I tried to not just write my poetry so that the words bring out certain images, but I tried to create a rhythm in a lot of the poems. I tried to create a specific rhythm for a specific scene. One that sticks out to me, I'm actually going to grab my book itself because there's one that sticks out to me as I'm thinking about it, which was a very short one. It's called, I think it's just called Pad, Pad, Pad. If I have to remember the names of my own poems, there's 52 poems in this book, so it's easy to uh, it's easy to miss it. But there's one that has a specific rhythm on purpose. When You're actually in chapter 10 of the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and chapter 10 in my book. The middle poem is called Pad, 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 because this is something that Lucy sees. They're on a trek. They're going through the snow on a trek. They're running from the queen, trying to get to safety. And after a while, all that Lucy can think of is pad, 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 pad. And this is what the book tells us. It's pad, pad. She's just watching the beavers tell. And so I wrote the poem in such a way that it's meant to carry the rhythm of the story. And so I'm just going to read part of it to kind of get that rhythm to it, where it says, pad, 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 panting on, onward, onward, march, march, pad, 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 pushing on, upward, upward, climb, climb, swish, 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 trekking forth, forward, forward, go, go, swish, 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 trudging through, frontward, frontward, move, move. And of course, I'm not going to read the very last part there. You can read that yourself, but it's meant to have that pace where you're walking, bum, 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 bum,
Yeah.
bum, bum, and that's all that's in your mind. And so there were quite a few poems in here that I purposefully put a certain rhythm to them that I think Lewis put within the story itself. It's a rhythm, music that's in the
Mm.
story that you're meant to follow along. And uh, maybe I'll give myself away here. The third poem in chapter 10, where they meet Father Christmas, I love that scene. I did my best. I don't want to shoot myself down here, but I really did do my best to make it a copy of the rhythm that is supposed to be "'Twas the Night Before Christmas." So when you read, it's called "A New Day Dawning." When you read that poem, you're meant to pick up the rhythm of "'Twas a night before Christmas, when all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse." You're supposed to get that rhythm out of it because that's kind of the rhythm of that story, this excitement of Christmas. Father Christmas, he's here. Father Christmas, the winter is coming to an end. Joy. It's funny that Father Christmas, Santa Claus, is the image of winter, but he's not just the image of winter. He's the image of joy in the middle of winter. He's the image almost like of spring, but in the middle of winter. He's the image of happiness and redness and like sunshine, and he's the image of, like I said, joy in the middle of what would be a dead winter. And he's a sign that winter's power, or Saturn actually, Saturn's power is coming to an end because the joy of Father Christmas is showing that Aslan is on the move. And I tried to create that rhythm within my poetry throughout the book, that it's not just the words and it's not just the images, but it's also that rhythm of the music that you're meant to read it. And I want my readers to be able to read those words, to catch those rhythms and get that mood. It's meant to pull you. If some people read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and they may miss the mood of the chapter, they may miss that mood, they may miss that imagery, they may not quite catch the heart of it. And I hope that my poetry can take and enlighten their heart to really catch it. I mean, Lewis is a great author. I'm not trying to add to what he did. I cannot. That would be absurd. But
Mm.
what I am doing is trying to take and create that rhythm to draw people even deeper into one of the most fantastic works of literature that can be read. Honestly, it's a beautiful work of literature that can capture the minds and hearts of children, like my children, 4, 5, 6 years old, all the way up to people who are in their 80s and in their 90s, can go back and read it and still love these works because they make us children. They make us find that joy of children, that foolish joy that children have. And I hope that my rhythm, throughout some of the poetry, really has done that as well. So I'm glad you mentioned the music of it, because I did actually attempt to do that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's great. Some of the most powerful, greatest works of stories, of storytelling. You think about Shakespeare or the Odyssey, or when you're reading these are poems, and there's a rhythm to them. And for those who may be listening that aren't familiar with poetry or don't understand why that's important, it's the way that the language is read that actually pulls you into a story. So it has sort of a it's an art because it's so every detail matters. And so like when I'm reading the Odyssey, that's a story that not only is the story itself so rich and powerful, but also the words that are chosen, the language, the feel of reading the Odyssey, or when you read Shakespeare. There's nothing like a Shakespeare sonnet, when you're sharing that and you're reading that out loud. It's something that you can read, and it's so powerful, it's gripping. And so I like this companion because there's a lot of poetry involved, and so you're reading through some of the stories that you've already read. Like you said, you're not trying to add to the story, you're not changing anything necessarily in the story, but you're reflecting on the story, you're reflecting on the scenes in the story. And so I think it's good for that. So is there any particular audience or person that you're trying to reach? You mentioned, this is something that may be beneficial for kids, or for, even those who are older. So is there a particular audience, or is this a sort of a universal, anybody could read?
Well, one of those rules as a writer is that you're meant to think of your audience and you're supposed to focus on your audience and then you speak to your audience. It's something you're supposed to do. Any good writer needs to do that. Well, of course, I think Lewis actually argues against that to a point, but this is just one of the ways we think about writing. We say, think of your audience, focus on your audience, write to your audience. And I tried to do that with this work. I even wrote about it in my preface in Joy Through a Wardrobe, that it was almost impossible to think of writing this that way.
Mm,
Rather, what I did is try to think, what am I trying to do? Not who am I trying to reach, but what am I trying to do? And try to write it in such a way that whether it's a young person who's maybe a young teenager who can read this work on their own, or even a little younger than that, depending on their reading level, can read this work on their own, or whether it be someone who's in their early 20s who's going back to The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, or maybe reading it for the first time by influence of the movies, or whether it's a parent or a teacher who's trying to teach The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I wrote it in such a way that each one can use it differently. So a young person can read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and read Joy through a Wardrobe at the same time. And what it'll do is it'll start highlighting those small little elements of joy. It'll start highlighting those little parts of the story that may escape them and give them a little further insight. And then through the reflections that are kind of semi devotional, help highlight those spiritual elements that Lewis meant to encourage us within the story and pull them along further. Someone who's a little older, who will understand more of what I've written, both in the poetry and within the reflections, it's meant to encourage them not just to read the story, but to apply it to their own life, because they've got the ability. A lot of people in their 20s are looking for answers in life, and they're out there reading and watching videos and looking for answers to life's big questions, trying to figure out who they are. A young person, maybe not quite a younger person in their early teens or something, is not quite asking those advanced questions yet, but someone in their early 20s going back to The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, maybe asking those big questions of life. And so I wrote it in such a way that I hope that person, when they read it, they start finding those big answers that The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe provide for you, about meaning and about joy and about trusting and having faith and the goodness that we find in Aslan and overcoming winter. Or a parent can read this book and read it to their children, read the poetry along with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe to their young children who maybe can't read, but they can enjoy the story and they can enjoy the funness of the poetry, especially with the rhythms to it. And then they themselves can read the reflections that are semi devotional, and they can get something out of it. They can get a spiritual influence out of it themselves, and it can strengthen them, whether it be just through the joy of the poetry or the devotional reflection, or a teacher who maybe is teaching it to intermediate level students. You're reading The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and you want to be able to give your students further insight. Well, I say to that teacher, read Joy Through a Wardrobe, and it will help you as a companion to The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. It'll help you not just highlight the spiritual and theological elements of the book, it'll help highlight those undergirding images and metaphors, the kind of little bits of allegory here and there. It'll help highlight those things to give you a further inkling into what's really going on in this book, what's really going on in this literature. So I don't want to say that I've necessarily written it as with a universal audience in mind. Rather, I've written it with a universal message in mind. And I don't want to misspeak, but I think Lewis, when he wrote this, was really just more thinking about the story and then thinking about the message and allowing that good story to be able to reach both a child and an adult at the same time. I tried to write my poetry and reflections to do the same thing, to go along perfectly as a companion with this great work, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, to where anyone can read it because the message is for everyone. It's not that I had a universal audience in mind, it's that I had a universal message in mind. And that's really what imaginative apologetics for Christianity is all about, that universal truth. And
Mm.
that's what I've done with this work. I have done my best to do that with this work.
Well, Donald, where can my listeners find the book if they want to get a copy of it?
Okay, well, it's on Amazon. You can go to Amazon and you can find a hardback or paperback. There's not a Kindle version yet. I'm not sure when that's going to be up. You can go to Amazon and you'll find it there, or also it's on Barnes and Noble. It would be even on whippifandstock.com. And Google has, if you go to Google Books, they actually have a digital version there, where it's, last I looked, it was about $10 for the, if you want the digital version, you can go to Google to get that digital version. So that you can find those bits and pieces of it there. Oh, sorry, you can find the book at those websites, but also I have a website myself, donaldwcatchingsjr.com. And if you go there, I've posted a couple of videos of me reading some of the poems, but I also have a weekly or a monthly newsletter. You can sign up for that, and when you sign up for it, I will give you a free audio version of the very first chapter of my book, Joy Through a Wardrobe. So those are some of the ways that you can connect with this work. You can either go and you can buy it on Amazon, Google, Barnes and Noble, any of those bookstores. You can get a free audio version of the first chapter by subscribing to my newsletter via my website, donaldwcatchingsjr.com, or you can go to my website or to my YouTube, which is Donald W. Catchings Jr. And I actually you'll see a few videos of me reading some of the poems.
Yeah, please go check it out. It would be worth your time if you're listening to check out this book. I've had a chance to read through it myself, and I've already said this, but it's a wonderful companion to the Chronicles. It's something I would recommend anyone use. He has some pretty amazing endorsements on the book as well. So I thought that was that was really a good stamp of approval to have. Dr. Ward and several others put their endorsement in. I believe was Dr. Ordway one of those as well.
Yes, actually, the most nerve-wracking part of writing this whole book was getting the endorsements.
Yeah,
I felt like I knew what I was doing, and I'm writing all this poetry, I'm writing these reflections, and then I got to send out an email to Dr. Ward, and I sent out an email to Dr. Ordway and Melissa Kane Travis
mm,
and Zach Schmall, and I'm just sitting back going, oh, and even Dr. Talon, and I'm sitting back going, oh my God, what are they going to say? These are the people that have influenced me to write the book.
right.
If it weren't for Dr. Ward and Dr. Ordway, I loved C.S. Lewis's work, but I never would have written this work at all. I would never,
Mm,
it never would have crossed my mind. So I had to send those endorsement emails out, and they came back positive, especially
mm,
Dr. Ordway. She copied me in on her endorsement, and it was the day after Christmas on the Feast of Stevens. And I got that, and I really needed it spiritually. I needed it at that time. I was having a hard time going back through this book. When you go through the editing process of a book, you go back through and you start doubting yourself. And she copied me in on her endorsement, all the endorsements are on the back of the book. And it was a very positive endorsement that just uh, gladdened my heart, really did. And when I saw Dr. Ward's endorsement, I couldn't have been more ecstatic. When I saw Dr. Melissa Kane Travis's endorsement, it really was overwhelming for me. And Zach
mhm,
Schmall from An Unexpected Journal, um, that's a friend of mine. And I just having these endorsements made it made the entire work almost, maybe sometimes yes and sometimes no, but it felt like it made the entire work worth it. All the
Right.
months I spent writing it, putting it together, when I had people that I truly respect and have made me change the way I look at literature, people have helped me become a totally different thinker and a totally different person, people who have made me better via their friendships and through their mentorships. When I had their endorsements, wow, that was just something, just to be able to
Yeah.
look at it and say thank you. And so yes, there are some great endorsements on this work, and I really just, if nothing else, I hope people go, they buy Joy Through a Wardrobe, they read it, and it does lead them to reconnect with the joy in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And I feel these endorsements have supported me. I believe it's a work that can do it, and I it gave me joy just to have them. So I'm glad for it.
Yeah, I'll just add to that too. The reason I think Donald was so probably concerned to reach out to a few of these, I can speak for Dr. Ordway or Dr. Ward, is they will not put their stamp of approval on something unless it is good. And so you really have to, and that's a good thing. Seeing those endorsements lets people know that here's some of the brightest scholars in the business with Dr. Ward, Dr. Ordway, Dr. Travis, Dr. Talon, these names you've mentioned. These are some of the best in the business, and to get their endorsement shows a lot on your end of your work. And so I know you are a new writer. This is your first big project to put out there, and that can be intimidating. But I hope my listeners will go check it out because it's definitely worth their time. And I will say too, Donald is teaching some courses this fall at Kepler. If you're looking for some classical Christian education. I just want to plug that too. I am teaching at Kepler as well, and so it's a really unique school where I don't even think they like to call it a school because it's more of a place for you to go and find the courses you need as a junior high or high school student that wants to learn apologetics or learn poetry. You get to learn from people like Donald, and I'm looking forward to seeing that. And I hope my listeners will go grab the book. And yeah, wishing you all the best, and really appreciate you taking some time today to come and talk about the book with me.
It was my pleasure.
I pop a Willie and move. I pop a Willie and move. I pop a Willie and move it. Continuous will of my music. Gassed up, you get passed up if you talk down. You get strapped up, got a sheet mask, I just move